7825, code 6.
The clues gathered at a homicide challenge investigators' preconceptions. The evidence now compels them to search for the killer in the last place they'd think to look. An unidentified body is abandoned on a Texas freeway. Investigators have miles to go before they gather enough clues to nail her killer. A young woman disappears. Detectives must weave a missing persons case around a tattered shirt and a shard of plastic. Big crimes are often solved by the smallest clues. Every criminal takes something away from the crime scene and leaves something behind. Forensics is the science of building a case by reading each remnant of blame. Northeast of Atlanta sits the city of Sugar Hill, Georgia. It's a little city of about 5,000 people, but it found itself in the midst of a big city problem. On the morning of April 16, 1993, a garage owner found a car abandoned in his parking lot. When he looked inside, he discovered a terrible crime. The body of a woman was slumped in the driver's seat, dead. Officers of the Gwinnett County Police Department responded to the scene. From the position of her body and the direction of the blood spatter, it was clear the woman had been shot in the head. Her purse was not in the car. Police could find no identification, nor did they have a suspect. But the evidence did point to a motive. Assistant Police Chief John Latty believed this was a carjacking gone wrong.
The ignition was on, but the engine was off, gas in the tank. She had power windows, and her window was rolled down, but she was seat belted in the car.
In a random crime like carjacking, the perpetrator leaves few clues. Police didn't even know where to begin. All that changed with the arrival of a man named Michael Thompson. Driving by the scene, he noticed the commotion. Then he saw the car. It looked like his mother's. To Latty, Thompson's arrival was too much of a coincidence.
We were interested in him due to the fact that he showed up at the scene about the time we did. Also, he had a shady past. He had a criminal history, was a suspected drug user, and so therefore the preliminary suspicion fell on him.
Michael Thompson confirmed what the vehicle registration had indicated. The victim was his mother, Emma Jean Thompson, age 53. When police checked into Thompson's background, they learned that his mother had called police in early April to report a burglary. Gwinnett County Police Officer Michael Chappell responded to that call. He was told that $7 of the $15,000 the victim kept taped to the back of her dresser had been stolen. Michael Thompson didn't know it, but Emma Jean had told Chappell she thought her son might have stolen the money. She was banking on Officer Chappell to catch the burglar and, if possible, find her money.
She actually showed him, upon his request, the remainder of the money, which was we estimate to be in the neighborhood of $7,000. And all the money was in new $100 bills.
Officer Chappell assured the victim that the money would be easy to find because it was in consecutively numbered, brand new bills. After the murder of Emma Jean Thompson, police discovered that the rest of the cash was missing from its unusual hiding place. They believed Thompson might have killed his mother for the money. They would just have to prove it. The autopsy revealed that the victim had been shot twice in the head at close range with a large caliber weapon. Someone in the area must have heard the shots. Police set up roadblocks to question drivers about what they remembered from the night before. They found an unusual number of potential witnesses. Emma Jean Thompson had been murdered on April 15th. Traffic driving past the murder scene on the way to the nearby post office had been heavy.
Many of them remembered it because it was tax day, and they said, we observed a vehicle sitting behind the victim's vehicle. All of them said it appeared to be a police vehicle. That not only was it a patrol car, but it was one of Gwinnett County police patrol cars, and that it was a specific type and design of a police car, so we were able to determine that it was one of ours.
Witnesses pinpointed the police car at the murder scene between 9:30 and 10:30 p.m. Many said it looked as if the victim's car had been pulled over. This disturbing revelation steered suspicion away from the victim's son. As more witnesses came forward, police had to consider the awful possibility that the killer was one of their own. The investigation began within the department. Detectives were aware that Officer Michael Chappell had responded to the victim's burglary complaint 2 weeks earlier. When Chief Latty looked for Chappell's report on the case, he couldn't find it. Chappell was asked about it.
This is okay. If you go ahead and file it.
His reason for not filing a report on the burglary seemed credible.
Of course, he had explanations that he thought it was a BS case and that he didn't want to bother with writing a report. So I instructed him to gather all the information from that time and to write a report.
While Chappell prepared the belated report, detectives interviewed the victim's friends.
How you doing? I'm Detective Smith.
They said Emma Jean Thompson had been touched by Officer Chappell's personal interest in her burglary case.
During the course of having these conversations with her friends, she also told her friends that Officer Chappell was concerned about her and was keeping an eye on her, and that she had observed him following her on several occasions. She believed that he was concerned about her and was looking out for her.
To detectives, it was beginning to look as though this guardian angel may have had only his own interests at heart. But they had no evidence to support this theory. Chappell had an alibi for the time of the murder. He said he went to the firehouse to watch TV between 8 and 10:30 p.m. Interviews at the firehouse, however, did not allay suspicion. His friends agreed Chappell was present on the night of the 15th, but no one could agree about when he left. Chappell's alibi was shaky. He still might have had the opportunity to commit the crime. A background check revealed a possible motive. Before the murder, Chappell had been heavily in debt. After the murder, his creditors told police he paid off what he owed with crisp $100 bills. But this would never be enough to convict one of Gwinnett County's finest. Detectives needed more proof before they could make an arrest. They had to be absolutely certain. Investigators soon learned the victim may have met her death by appointment.
We did an interview with one of the victim's close friends who told us that she had had a conversation with the victim, and the victim had reported that she was to meet with Officer Chappell that night, and that he'd instructed her to bring her money because he'd recovered some of her money and could compare serial numbers and hopefully recover some for her. I don't envy them that task.
1 week after the crime, Officer Chappell was called in for a second round of questioning.
If I'd ever had the slightest thought that I'd be sitting here tonight talking to you about a murder, I'd have stayed out there.
Chief Latty talked with Chappell in the police station for hours, hoping he could give them some information that would point the blame elsewhere. He could not.
There are no other suspects at this point.
It was during the course of the interview, probably about 2 hours into the interview, that Investigator Burnett came into the room and informed him that he was being charged with this crime.
Chappell became an enemy of the law he had sworn to uphold.
He reacted by slumping, sighing, and began to talk about the fact that he knew there was no bond for a murder charge and an armed robbery charge, and he'd probably be in jail for a long time before he could prove his innocence.
That is overwhelming evidence. All I've got is what I know happened, and that's not going to do me any good. I have no alibi. I have nothing.
Nothing would make Latty happier than if Chappell could prove he was innocent. But friendship must take a back seat to justice. The chief knew what he had to do. Chappell was relieved of duty and told to turn in his gun and his badge. It was important to treat this case like any other. Only the evidence could prove whether or not Chappell pulled the trigger. Did Officer Michael Chappell kill Emma Jean Thompson in cold blood? To find out, search warrants were executed for his locker and the trunk of his patrol car. Chappell's belongings were entered as evidence and examined closely. His raincoat was sent to the lab and tested for any kind of trace evidence. Tests for minuscule amounts of blood were positive. The stains were shaped like high-velocity blood spatter. When a bullet strikes a body, the impact creates a fine mist of fluids that often blows back toward the weapon and the shooter. While the blood was being analyzed, detectives received another lead from a sharp-eyed car wash manager.
Officer Chappell had been into the car wash on the day that we had discovered the victim's body, and that he'd had his car detailed, his patrol car. Also that he had paid her with a new $100 bill for the work on the car.
His patrol car was brought to the crime lab and examined for potential evidence the detailers might have missed. An adhesive strip was used to lift any hair or fibers left by the victim. One stain on the upholstery warranted closer inspection. Jennifer Archer of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Serology and DNA Unit was given a head start on her work.
When I received the call from Gwinnett County Police Department, they indicated to me that they had performed a field test called luminol. This test showed them that there was a possibility that there was a blood stain on the armrest of the car seat of the patrol car.
Archer tested a swatch from the armrest to see if the stain was truly blood. She dabbed the cloth with 2 moistened cotton swabs. Each swab was then treated with a different chemical. Both swabs changed color, confirming the presence of blood. Was the blood human? Scientists had a test for that, too. A drop of the unknown blood was added to a sample of human antiserum, an enzyme that reacts with proteins found only in human blood. Gravity pulls the blood through the antiserum. If the blood is human, a white line appears. The blood in the police car and on the raincoat was human. Only the results of a DNA comparison could definitely link the bloodstains to the victim, Emma Jean Thompson. The blood was placed in a gel medium and subjected to an RFLP test. In this process, mild electrical current separates the longer and shorter fragments of DNA into a banding pattern unique to the donor. Upon inspection, the patterns in the victim's DNA resembled the sample taken from the cruiser's armrest. Computer analysis statistically confirmed the match. No more than 1 in 10 billion people would share these patterns. Detectives had forged an unbroken chain of evidence between Chappell's coat, his vehicle, and the blood of Emma Jean Thompson. The lab confirmed the grim reality. One of Gwinnett County's cops was a killer. With the forensic evidence in place, events leading up to the murder became clear. On April 15th, Chappell arranged to meet his victim to rob her of the money the burglar had left behind. When the victim opened her purse, Chappell opened fire. Most of the incriminating blood evidence on the coat and in the patrol car was barely visible to the naked eye. But forensic science brought the remnants of the crime into sharp relief in court.
The one key piece of evidence was the DNA evidence. There's no question about that. It's such powerful evidence. And the fact that there was probably some very serious doubt in the minds of a lot of people that Officer Chappell could have or would have committed this crime. And so it took some kind of profound or solid physical evidence to link him to the victim's blood.
As always, the ultimate test of the forensic evidence took place in the jury box. After 18 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict against Michael Chappell. But he received more mercy than he had shown his victim. He was sentenced to 2 life terms plus 5 years in prison, the stiffest penalty allowed by Georgia law, short of a death sentence. Chappell disguised his crime to look like a failed carjacking. Other killers try to hide their crimes by disposing of the body. The roads leading to Houston are kept as beautiful as the city itself. But on March 27, 1992, a litter crew on a freeway outside of town made an ugly discovery.
You got a TV? Anybody need a TV? Go ahead. Hey, let's see it.
The cardboard box seemed ordinary at first.
Get this stuff. Let's do it.
But when they pulled back the flaps, they found themselves staring into a makeshift coffin. Within lay the dismembered remains of a human being. The Houston Police Department's Homicide Division dispatched a forensics unit to the scene. Technicians scoured the roadside for evidence. The victim had been dead several hours. Dismembering the body would have spilled up to 12 pints of blood. But not a drop of blood or any other clue was discovered in the vicinity. Sergeant Mike Peters believed most of the forensic evidence lay elsewhere.
Well, the conclusion that we came to is that this wasn't the actual crime scene. This is just a place where the victim had been placed by the suspect after the crime occurred.
Police had to rely on the box's contents for leads to the killer. Besides the body, it didn't contain much. Just an old blue blanket. In the crime lab, investigators tried to identify the victim. But all they had was the torso. And beneath it, the victim's right arm. Police had to depend on partial remains to tell the full story. They determined the victim was a woman in her early 20s. The autopsy revealed she was pregnant. Investigators tried to match her fingerprints, but they weren't on file. Sergeant Peters hoped to have better luck with the missing persons reports. Only the night before, police had received a call from a man named Oscar Reyes. He said his wife, Cecilia, hadn't come home from her job at a liquor store. Police found Reyes and his wife's co-worker making missing persons flyers to post in the neighborhood. Oscar Reyes was able to identify his wife's torso from a surgical scar on her neck. His wife had been found, but her killer was still at large.
Monday morning of last week.
What's the make and model on it, do you know?
Investigators had to consider the possibility that Oscar Reyes had murdered his wife.
She works at Walmart.
Detectives interviewed him and checked his home for signs of foul play. If Cecilia Reyes had been murdered here, they would have found a large quantity of blood. None was detected. With Oscar Reyes off the suspects list, the investigators had to find other leads.
Hey, how you doing?
They went to the store where Cecilia worked.
I need to ask you a few questions.
Her manager said that she was last seen the night before as she headed home. Her co-workers described her as a cheerful, open-hearted woman with no known enemies. But she did have an unwanted admirer. A man named Gerardo Marquez occasionally hung around the store. They said he enjoyed flirting with the women, especially Cecilia. He often brought her presents, though she asked him not to. He seemed strange, but harmless enough.
Right here, my
Police paid a visit to Gerardo Marquez, who lived a few miles from the liquor store. He was a 36-year-old part-time fence builder who had a girlfriend. He was distressed to learn of the death of Cecilia Reyes. He hardly seemed like the kind of monster capable of killing and dismembering someone. He didn't hesitate to allow police to search his apartment. When asked about the scratches on his face, Marquez told police he'd cut himself while climbing a fence. His explanations seemed entirely plausible. His manner was completely disarming. Then, traces of blood were found in his bathroom sink. Marquez said he'd cut himself. Detectives reasoned that if a body had been dismembered here, much more blood would have been spilled. The killer's identity and the original crime scene remained a mystery. At the Houston Police Department Crime Lab, technicians looked for clues they hoped would lead to other suspects. They traced the box to a manufacturer in the same neighborhood as Marquez, but there the trail grew cold. Attention focused on the blanket that had been the victim's shroud. Though free of blood, it might conceal other clues. Hair, fibers, and other easy-to-miss trace evidence are often more revealing than a conspicuous bloodstain. Criminalist Raiden Hillman examined it.
There were several areas that looked like stains, but they were in a particular pattern that indicated that maybe a piece of furniture had been sat down on top of the blanket and refinished or painted on top of it.
She measured the pattern of the dark stains. The legs of the furniture that had rested on the blanket formed a rectangle 14 inches wide by 25 inches long. While taking the measurements, she also noted minute feathers lodged in the weave of the blanket. She sent them for analysis.
And you
In a
have
case
no
with
idea
few
what
leads, detectives made the most of what they had. They asked Marquez's girlfriend to come to the police station for more questioning. She mentioned that Marquez did own a blue blanket stained with paint.
It was under the dresser.
She hadn't seen it recently. The blanket seemed to link Marquez to the crime, but detectives had to be sure it was the same blanket the girlfriend had spoken of. The distance between the paint spots would provide the answer.
So armed with these measurements, Sergeant Stevens, Shirley, and myself went out to Marquez's house and measured the post legs on the base of the bureau, and they exactly measured the markings on the blanket.
The dark stains on the blanket matched the dimensions of Marquez's bureau. Next, Hillman had to be certain that the stains came from the bureau. Following the trail of trace evidence, she reasoned that if the bureau left its mark on the blanket, then the blanket must have left its traces on the bureau.
There would be fibers from the blanket stuck on the bottom of the furniture, and at least tie the blanket back to the place where the murder had occurred.
Hillman's theory about the fibers was soon proved true. Investigators found tiny blue filaments stuck to the tips of the dresser legs. With the fibers and the bureau legs, investigators began to build a case against Gerardo Marquez. To make the link between the victim and Marquez's apartment ironclad, Hillman used an infrared spectrometer to compare the paint on the blanket with the paint on the bureau.
All right, we're going to try to match up to some paint that was found in the apartment.
Spectrometer shines infrared light on the sample, which absorbs and reflects it in certain ways, producing a spectrum. The apparatus then measures how the sample absorbs the light and displays the measurements as a series of peaks and valleys. Every substance has its own unique spectroscopic fingerprint.
In looking at the total spectrum, we can see what type of paint it is, and also we would compare the known sample, as this is, to any unknown samples.
The spectra from the paint on the bureau and from the paint on the blanket lined up. The paint matched.
So you already measured this?
Hillman and Sergeant Peters compared the fibers on the dresser leg with the fabric of the blanket. Once again, the two samples had come from the same source, Marquez's apartment.
He had some questions to answer about why this blanket that was obviously affiliated with the victim was now affiliated with his apartment also.
Based on the information from the lab, detectives now believe they had found their man. They returned to Marquez's home. He remained cooperative and made it clear that he was eager for police to solve the case. He admitted that the blanket was his, but after using it as a drop cloth, he said he tossed it into a dumpster. The real killer must have retrieved it to wrap the body. The explanation was convenient and irrefutable. But investigators still had work to do. They re-examined his bathroom using leucomalachite, a chemical that makes traces of blood glow. It illuminated blood on the shower curtain. These stains could not have been the result of a minor cut. But again, Marquez had an easy explanation. He disclosed that he slaughtered his own chickens in the bathtub.
Oh, that's where I keep the chickens. Yeah, you know better.
The freezer contained the proof and the likely source of the feathers Hillman found on the blanket. While they were in the kitchen, Marquez offered investigators some refreshments. Gerardo Marquez was acting like a man who was either completely innocent or totally cold-blooded. As police searched for the killer of Cecilia Reyes, they pinned their hopes on the blood evidence recovered from the apartment of Gerardo Marquez. Marquez had told police that the blood found on his shower curtain was chicken blood. The lab would determine if Marquez was telling the truth. swabs of the blood were tested with human anti-serum. It reacted, proving the blood on the shower curtain was shed by a human, not a chicken. But investigators didn't find enough blood to do a complete battery of tests, and not enough to indicate that a murder took place here. However, there was enough blood and enough questions to warrant another visit to Marquez. Technicians arrived to pull up the floor tiles in his bathroom. The room had been thoroughly scrubbed, but the evidence remained just below the surface.
All right, this is Mark. It was obvious that there had been, at one point, quite a bit. There was enough that had soaked down underneath the floor tiles.
Tests on the sample revealed it was type O. Both Marquez and his girlfriend had given blood samples, and neither had that type. But Cecilia Reyes did. She had been here. She had died here. Based on the forensic evidence, Gerardo Marquez was arrested and charged with the murder of Cecilia Reyes. When presented with the evidence amassed against him, he said that while his girlfriend was out, Reyes had voluntarily come to his apartment. They argued, and she fell, struck her head, and died. In a panic, he had disposed of the body, fearing no one would believe his story. Investigators told Marquez that in order to believe him, they needed to examine the rest of the body to confirm the cause of death.
Where is it, right here?
Cooperative as ever, Marquez led police to a field on the outskirts of Houston.
Do this. Yeah, right.
There, abandoned in 2 more corrugated boxes, was the balance of the victim's remains.
Go ahead and radio this.
7825, code 6, 105 North Avenue, 52.
An autopsy revealed a bruise on the victim's head, supporting Marquez's story. Then, medical examiners found a deep knife wound in her throat. The stab wound was above the area where the victim had been dismembered and appeared to have been made by a different type of blade. That suggested the wound had been inflicted prior to the victim's death, and not during the gruesome dismemberment. Once again, the suspect was caught in a lie. Police pieced together what had probably happened on the victim's last night alive. Leaving work as usual, Cecilia Reyes was accosted by Marquez.
Hi.
He abducted her and brought her to his apartment. There, she rebuffed his sexual advances, inflicting the scratches detectives had seen on his face. During the struggle, he stabbed her to death. To expunge evidence that the victim had ever been at his home, Marquez dismembered her remains. Then he placed the body inside 3 cardboard boxes. In the dead of night, he abandoned the boxes miles from his apartment. Though the suspect's guilt was ultimately written in blood, an ordinary blanket propelled the investigation. Gerardo Marquez was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Often, the most grisly murders are solved with the most mundane clues. The trick is knowing where to look and how to use them. Most homicide cases start with a body. This one began with a chance observation, a torn shirt half hidden in the grass, and a dark stain in the road that might be blood. When Officer Kenny Corcoran noticed them soon after breakfast one Sunday outside his house on Smiling Acres Road in Tangipahoa Parish, Louisiana, he knew just what to do. Call Detective Chester Pritchett.
Tell you what I got, Chester. I got blood in the road here. You see the mark of the car.
As soon as he arrived, Pritchett wanted to see what Corcoran had found. There was a stain in the road, Corcoran explained, most likely blood from a deer or a dog hit by a passing car. The torn shirt was a little harder to explain. Both men agreed they should dig into this a little deeper.
Well, I want to do it. I will. You hear something, you know, right?
Pritchett was known as a careful police officer. Before leaving home that Sunday morning, he had checked to see whether any accidents or missing persons had been reported. None had. Only on Tuesday did he learn of a young woman's disappearance. On the wall of the courthouse, Pritchett found a poster of a missing girl. Rebecca Forbes, a 19-year-old high school student who vanished a mere 48 hours earlier. She was wearing a white shirt, which seemed to match the one he found on Sunday.
I'm going to have to go talk to the family, get a better picture, get an idea of what she was wearing.
For Pritchett, her disappearance and the discovery of the torn shirt were sufficient grounds to begin an investigation. 6:30 p.m., Saturday, April 28, 1990. At her home in Dedham, Louisiana, Rebecca Forbes prepared for a night out at the Italian Festival in nearby Independence.
Bye, Mom.
It was the last time Virginia Forbes would see her daughter alive. At the festival, Rebecca met a young man. They talked and danced and were still together when Rebecca's friends lost track of her. None of them remembered hearing his name, but with the help of police records, Pritchett hoped they still might identify him. From police files, one of Rebecca Forbes' friends picked out the man's face. His name was Kelly Drott. Just 20 years old, he was well known as a troublemaker. He had been arrested more than once for house break-ins. In time, Pritchett would interview Drott to check his version of events at the festival. Before that, he hoped to have a report on the shirt Kenny Corcoran had found. At Louisiana State Crime Laboratory, Pritchett had given the shirt to forensic scientists George Skiro and Pat Lane. He asked them to learn all they could from it. Skiro's examination began with the physical state of the shirt. He scrutinized it for what is called trace evidence: hair, fibers, material of any kind adhering to it. Next, the most basic question: were the dark stains really blood? To determine that, Skiro conducted a cascade of chemical tests, designed successively to confirm or eliminate the presence of blood. First, a cotton swab was moistened with distilled water. Blood dissolves in water, turning the tip of the swab brown. Then, a reagent called phenolphthalein was added. Now, if blood was present, the brown stain would turn green. Next, a drop of hydrogen peroxide. Blood products produce an intense pink color. Finally, Skiro carried out a test to confirm his diagnosis.
Okay.
Adding another chemical, he looked for red crystals of hemochromogen, a chemical complex formed only in the presence of blood.
And this is the final step in proving that substance is blood. It's not species specific, this particular test. It just tells us that blood is present.
For Skiro, this was just the beginning. He would schedule further, more elaborate tests. Was it human blood he had found, or that of some animal? And if it was human, whose was it? Getting answers would grow more urgent as the investigation progressed. Meanwhile, Pritchett returned to Smiling Acres Road, which he had declared a crime scene. Inch by inch, his men scoured the ground, collecting anything, however insignificant, that could be a clue.
We recovered cigarette butts, There's a possibility of saliva off the cigarette butts, maybe assistance. We've got a couple beer cans and a bottle that could yield the same thing.
And there was this, a tiny piece of clear plastic.
I'm going to submit that, all these other items to the crime lab, just see if they can do something with them.
So we may get a good catch.
Was the fragment of plastic just roadside litter, or was it a clue? Several more weeks would pass before its true significance emerged.
I think we got some good information.
On Friday, May 4th, 6 days after Rebecca Forbes' disappearance, Detective Chester Pritchett finally caught up with suspect Kelly Drott. Did he simply have a brief encounter with Rebecca? Or did he know more than he was prepared to say? Drott admitted to meeting Rebecca. She bummed a cigarette from him. They danced. At around 10 o'clock, she disappeared into the crowd, and that was the last Drott saw of her, he said. Casual charmer or not, Kelly Drott's story began crumbling as soon as investigators examined his car.
In the trunk, there was no mat, no floor covering, and it had been pulled out. And there was water in the wheel well, which indicated to us he attempted to wash the car out. And on the hinges and under the tail light, we found splatters of what appears to be blood, tiny specks, a lot of them. He says that it's deer blood, where he ran over a deer, put the deer in the trunk, and it was thrashing around. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Pritchett immediately ordered the suspect's car impounded. It too would be scrutinized by George Skiro and Pat Lane at the crime lab.
I'll look in the outer way places where, for instance, if someone tried to clean up blood, where would this blood go? Would it seep down behind the seat cushions? Would it go into the threads of the fabric? I'll look in all those areas. I'll look in the out of the way areas.
As the search continued, Skiro began noticing blood in places inconsistent with someone having hit a deer. Blood marred the inside of the door jambs and the light switch. Now the pressure was on. Skiro had to determine the source of the blood, from the blood-stained shirt and in Kelly Drott's car.
Okay, once we determined that there was human blood on the blouse and human blood in the trunk, the next step was to do an ABO blood type and try and determine what type blood it was. When we did the examination, we found out that both samples from the blouse and in the trunk of the car were type O blood.
The test was less conclusive than Skiro had hoped. Type O blood is the most common human blood group. Here, as it turned out, both the possible victim and the possible suspect possessed it.
So it did not provide any information of value. The next step was to send it off for DNA analysis to see if a more specific genetic profile could be built up on the bloods.
It would require several weeks for the DNA tests to be completed. Before that, the case would take a dramatic new turn. Sunday, May 19th, 3 weeks after Rebecca Forbes was last seen, two men hunting along the Tangipahoa River stumbled across a badly decomposed corpse.
Well, the way this case started was with a mystery. We had some bloody clothes found in the middle of the road. Next thing we know, we got a vehicle that has blood in it, allegedly deer blood, but we proved otherwise that it was human blood. And the final thing we needed to bring this case together was to find a body that we could link to all these different scenes.
Critical to connecting the elements of the Rebecca Forbes case was GeneScreen, one of the most sophisticated testing laboratories in the United States. The state crime lab had identified both Rebecca's and Kelly Drott's blood type. GeneScreen was charged with refining those analyses. In our cells, we each possess our own unique individual form of DNA. GeneScreen's expertise is in testing bodily tissue to reveal its DNA fingerprint. Blood from Kelly Drott's truck and from the blood-stained woman's shirt had already been sent to the lab. The lab also received material from Rebecca Forbes' badly decomposed body. GeneScreen director Bob Giles.
DNA is a very useful forensic tool. It's very useful because it's highly discriminatory at identifying individuals. In this particular case, it was very important because this is a case involving circumstantial evidence. And without the DNA testing, the investigators were not able to link the victim's blood to the suspect's car.
When the test results were in, they could not have been clearer, as gene screen scientist Judy Floyd explains.
What the DNA did tell us, in effect, was that the blood on the blouse was that of Rebecca Forbes, and we can say that with a high degree of certainty. The blood in the back of the car of Mr. Drott was also that, most likely, of Rebecca Forbes, the victim. What the DNA did not tell us was what actually took place that night, the chain of events that led to that tragic attack.
One final piece of evidence cemented the case against Kelly Drott. That odd-shaped piece of plastic found near the bloody shirt on Smiling Acres Road. It was a fragment of crystal from a watch. Rebecca Forbes had been wearing a wristwatch when her body was found at the river. The broken crystal certainly looked as if it came from Rebecca's watch. It fit snugly onto its face. But Lane needed more evidence to prove that the two parts belonged together. Along the edge of the crystal, he noticed a series of pits, places where tiny pieces had been left behind when the crystal had been smashed. Lane made a cast of the underside of the rim to prove that the patterns on the rim and the crystal matched.
Okay, the piece that we're looking at right now is going to be the microcell cast that was done of the watch face, more specifically the rim area where the glass crystal would actually have been glued into or onto the face of the watch.
Now Lane could make a detailed comparison between the nicks along the edge of the crystal and the tiny fragments of plastic still trapped under the watch rim.
That piece of crystal fit in with the little imperfection breaks that had stuck in the track along the margin of that, and really turned out to be a very beautiful fracture match of that crystal.
With the final piece of evidence in place, the investigators were able to reconstruct what took place the night of the Italian festival. Rebecca had met Kelly and danced with him. Around midnight, he took her for a ride in his car. They stopped along Smiling Acres Road, where they argued. In a violent rage, Kelly Drott killed Rebecca Forbes.
The victim is dead, obviously, in this case. She can't talk. The suspect, even though he is talking, we don't know if he's being truthful or not. The physical evidence will not lie. It has the capability of telling us at a moment in time that a certain event took place. It may not necessarily tell us a whole sequence of events, but it allows us to at least pinpoint at one particular moment in time this event took place. That can then be weighed against the statements that have been made by suspect.
On May 23rd, just 4 days after the discovery of Rebecca's remains, Kelly Drott was arrested. Convicted of manslaughter, he was sentenced to 21 years in prison.
Well, Kelly worked on a construction crew at a local chicken processing plant, and he had a disagreement with one of his fellow employees that rides to work with him. He told the guy several days ago that if he didn't watch his mouth, he'd find himself in the river, just like that girl he had dumped in the river.
Evidence that can be seen by the naked eye is vital to solving a murder. But forensic science, coupled with rigorous investigative techniques, brings the smallest clues to light and brings more killers to justice.
Lab tech, over here.
Two murders are linked by unusual bullets, but linking them to the killers seems like a shot in the dark. A woman points the finger of blame at her killers. But catching them depends on a forensic technique that hasn't been invented yet. When detectives on the trail of cattle rustlers uncover what looks like serial murder, they call on forensics to help them round up their suspects. They say that a burden shared is a burden halved, but when partners team up for murder, the weight of their crime can drag them both down. The burden of proof is on forensics to capture partners in crime. November 19th, 1989, around 11:30 p.m. on the mean streets of Trenton, New Jersey, a passerby discovered a brutal murder. The victim was 38-year-old Francis C. Bodner, a driver for Golden Cabs.
All right, lab tech over here, please. Lab tech.
Officers at the scene examined the victim's body and combed the taxi for clues. Along with the slugs, they recovered a small metal disc with a raised edge, almost like a miniature bottle cap. It was a puzzling find. Detective Lieutenant Michael Salvatore felt it held the key to solving this crime.
Right, Carmine, tell me about that case from last night.
Because no one had ever seen that type of bullet before, that there was a possibility that the bullet had been created by an enthusiast, someone who loads their own bullets at home.
Hey, gentlemen.
If that were true, the bullets would be almost impossible to trace. But Salvatore hadn't seen the last of them. Just 4 hours later, he was called to another murder scene. A second taxicab driver was shot dead. Willie Rogers, age 33, had been discovered in the taxi he drove for the Diamond Cab Company.
What do we got, guys?
Again, investigators recovered the same odd metal disc, along with a spent bullet.
There she is. That's what we've been looking for.
And in both cases, witnesses reported seeing 3 black men in the taxi prior to the murder. The evidence technicians soon produced another clue, a fingerprint lifted from the first taxi's front passenger side door. The Trenton Police Department's evidence lab transmitted the print to the National Fingerprint Database, a clearinghouse for fingerprint evidence from around the country. It would take some time before the results came back. And there was no guarantee the print on the cab belonged to the killer. The Mercer County medical examiner performed the autopsies later that day. Bodner and Rogers were both killed by a single shot to the back of the head, execution style. The executioners left behind little besides the unusual bullets. To solve the execution-style murders, Trenton police had to rely on ballistic evidence taken from the crime scene. It's all they had. By 11 o'clock on the morning the drivers were killed, Trenton police had delivered the bullets to the New Jersey State Police Lab's Captain Mike Lysinger. The bullets perplexed him as much as they did Detective Salvatore, and Lysinger had been a ballistics expert for more than 20 years. His reference books showed that the little metal cap was called a gas check.
The gas check is very unusual because you never see this in commercial ammunition. This was the first time we have ever encountered a gas check as long as I've been in ballistics. This was something unique to us.
A gas check is placed on the base of the bullet to keep it from melting and clogging the gun barrel with lead. Many people who make their own bullets use gas checks. But Lysinger could tell these bullets were commercially manufactured, though no American company made them. Now, he had to determine what sort of gun fired them. Using the lab's stereo microscope, he identified the pattern of alternating grooves and the spaces between the grooves, or lands, left on the bullets as they sped through the gun barrel. These lands and grooves are a gun's class characteristics, and ballistics experts can use them to identify the type of weapon most likely to have left them on a bullet. Lysinger determined that the Trenton gas check bullets had a pattern of 5 lands and grooves with a twist to the right. He told Salvatore to look for a Taurus revolver, a Ruger revolver, or a Smith & Wesson. All of these were in common use among Trenton criminals. Any one of thousands of weapons could have left its mark on the bullets. Investigators didn't even know where to start looking. Before long, however, they got their first lead. In the early morning of November 27th, an anonymous caller told Trenton police that 2 of the gunmen were twins named Ron and John Allen. Later that same day, John Allen was picked up for smashing car windows during a street fight. Investigators had him brought up for an interview. John Allen said he had been with his twin Ron and their friend all evening the night the cabbies were killed. They had hung out at a couple of clubs until 3 a.m. Salvatore wasn't convinced, but without physical evidence tying John Allen to the killings, he had nothing. When John Allen's prints didn't match the one pulled from the taxi, detectives wondered about his brother. They pulled Ron Allen's prints from a previous arrest record. Trenton police compared Ron Allen's file print against the one left on the taxi. The point-by-point comparison was a match. Ron Allen had been in the murdered man's vehicle. That wasn't enough to prove he was the murderer. Taxis see dozens of fares each day, but the match told investigators they were on the right track. Police learned that the Allen brothers were Trenton locals who became involved with a rough and dangerous gang called the New York Boys. Turf was at a premium in the Big Apple, so the gangs there started colonizing New Jersey. The Allens were recruited.
I mean, Chief Williams knew all.
Detectives continued to interview friends and enemies of the Allen brothers, hoping to poke holes in their alibi, hoping for anything they could use.
On the street, just about everybody knew what was going on, but unfortunately, in a lot of the homicide cases I've worked on, people are very reluctant to come forward and give that information up.
The information they gathered continued to implicate the Allen brothers, but stopped short of being enough to arrest them. Then, on the evening of December 20th, 1989, one courageous eyewitness stepped forward. When police assured him that he'd be safe, he agreed to talk. He told police that he was parked directly behind the first victim's taxi during the crime. He saw Bodner shot from behind and heard the window shatter. Then he drove past the cab, fast, and saw 3 men going through Bodner's pockets. He identified Ron and John Allen as 2 of the 3 men he had seen in the cab that night. The dragnet was closing in on the Allen brothers. But a single fingerprint and a rushed eyewitness account might not be strong enough to win the maximum sentence for these alleged killers. Detectives still needed to find a way to use the killer's ammunition against them.
This is what I'm talking about right here.
The investigation into the gang-style murder of 2 Trenton taxi drivers was making slow progress. Police had a witness who could place the Allen brothers at the scene of one driver's murder. Now they had to place a gun in their hands. They got help from a police informant.
But what do you got for me?
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
You interested?
He
Yeah,
told
you
police
got
that
two
the
bodies
Allens
on
had tried to sell him guns and ammunition several weeks back, and that the guns had 2 bodies on them, 2 murders.
Yo, let me think about that. Yo, I just
He didn't buy them.
All right. Think about it, all right? Get back to it.
To prove the Allens' involvement, Detective Salvatore needed those guns. He sent the informant out to get them. The informant risked his life to do so.
On vacation today? Within 2 days, we received a phone call from the informant, and he had the weapons.
He turned over the 2 revolvers and a fistful of bullets that he had just purchased from the Allens.
Recently, our cabbies. We also have...
Salvatore sent the guns to the ballistics lab to compare with the slugs recovered from the taxis.
It's the same class character.
Both guns had 5 lands and grooves with a right-hand twist. Both could have fired the bullets found at the crime scenes. Another test would determine if one of them actually had. The guns were test-fired. The marks on the test-fired slugs from one of the guns matched the fatal slugs. Investigators had found the weapon they were looking for, the gun that killed Francis Bodner and Willie Rogers. Police obtained the warrants they needed to arrest the Allens. Officers swarmed over the places where they usually hung out. They found John Allen and brought him in. Ron Allen called Detective Salvatore a few hours later, asking about his twin. Detectives had the call traced.
While I was talking to Ron on the phone, we had a couple teams out here in West Trenton, a couple detective teams poised in various locations out here because we knew this is where they frequented and where he probably was. And as soon as we got the information from the Bell operator, we fed that information to our units on the street, and they came here and they forced their way into the house and arrested Ron Allen, who was still on the phone with me at the time of the arrest.
Tell me your story one more time.
At first, Ron Allen denied everything. Then, investigators listed the evidence against him. Allen gave it up, for him, for his twin, and for a third man. Allen said on the night of the murder, he and his twin were out with a man named Greg Williams. He claimed Williams pulled the trigger. By 7 that evening, an arrest warrant had been issued for Williams. 5 days later, authorities arrested him in Ocilla, Georgia. But Salvatore was never convinced for a minute that Williams had been the trigger man.
The weapon used in the murder of the 2 taxi drivers were guns owned by the Allen brothers. They were guns carried by the Allen brothers. They were guns held by the Allen brothers. So it was not likely that Gregory Williams possessed the gun and killed the cab drivers. We believe that it was the Allen brothers who killed them.
On July 10, 1990, Ronald and John Allen were convicted of the taxicab murders. On August 16th, they were sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. The Allen twins will be over 100 years old when they become eligible for parole. For his part in the crime, Greg Williams was sentenced to life as well. The Allen twins and Greg Williams killed 2 men for just over $100. Money they intended to spend in New York City to buy drugs they could peddle in Trenton. In jail, the Allens bragged about robbing and killing the taxi drivers, saying they were easy targets. With ballistics evidence, so were the Allens. The Allen brothers found their victims on the streets. But staying at home doesn't necessarily mean staying safe. Los Angeles, April 17, 1991. On this morning, Marilyn Rush knew something was wrong when her friend Joan Dawley didn't show up for work. Joan was never late, and she wasn't answering her phone. Concerned, Marilyn drove to the house Joan shared with her husband Dennis to make sure she was all right. Even though Joan's car wasn't in the driveway, Marilyn went inside to check on her friend. She found her in the bedroom.
Joan? 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 Oh, God.
When the LAPD responded to the crime scene, it looked at first glance like a botched burglary. The bedroom had been ransacked. Joan Dawley's bruised hands told investigators that she had tried to defend herself. The Dawleys' neighborhood had had a rash of break-ins, and this one matched the pattern. Outside, a screen had been removed from an open window, and a ladder stood beneath it. But as police worked the scene, they began to compile a growing list of clues that didn't fit with the burglary scenario. The damp ground under the window had no footprints or marks from the ladder. The windowsill, where the burglars allegedly climbed in, was clean of any dirt or scuff marks.
I didn't see any dirt, mud, broken leaves, pieces of leaves, nothing out there.
And $100 was left in plain sight on the kitchen counter. It appeared as if someone had worked hard to make it look like Joan Dawley had interrupted a burglary. LAPD detective Paul Tippin wasn't convinced.
All of these things together with the evidence at supposedly the point of entry didn't add up. Initially, of course, you look at it as a burglary murder, but as it progressed, it turned out to be a fabricated crime scene, basically.
Police suspected the murderer had contrived the scene after killing Dawley. Officers notified the victim's husband, Dennis Dawley, and asked him some routine questions.
If you have that type of a murder, you're going to have to eliminate the spouse. You have to get over that hurdle before you can go to the next step.
Dennis told police that he and Joan were high school sweethearts, married 35 years. He'd last spoken to his wife the night before. She was still asleep when he left the house at 4:45 that morning for his job at the golf course. He had no idea what could have happened or who could have wanted his wife dead. He said he couldn't bear to stay in the house. If police had more questions, they could reach him at the home of his daughter, Debbie Myers.
Evidence that you can gather.
With Dennis Dawley above suspicion, Tippin pressed forward in his search for clues to this hideous murder.
We'll now take that bag.
The autopsy found that the victim had been killed by blunt force trauma to the back of her head. Tests turned up no evidence of sexual assault. The coroner discovered traces of blood and foreign matter under the victim's fingernails. But investigators had no certain way of telling whether it was the killers or the victims. In these early days of DNA technology, accurate testing required large samples. Testing the traces of material from under the victim's nails would jeopardize the sole piece of potential evidence.
My first question was, do you think we can get DNA evidence from any evidence under her nails? And the answer was yes, but once we do it, then we may destroy all of the evidence through the analysis. So I was real reluctant at that time to do it.
The risk was too great. Tippin would have to rely on old-fashioned detective work to solve this one, at least for now. 4 days after the murder, Joan Dawley's missing car reappeared. Her son-in-law spotted it in a parking lot across the street from the card store where Joan had worked. Police found her keys, but no useful clues. Two days after the victim's funeral, Detective Tippin called Dawley at his daughter's house to see if he had noticed anything else the burglars may have taken.
All right, see you when I get back.
But
Okay.
Debbie Myers told Tippin that her father was gone. Dawley said that he needed to get away. He planned to spend a few days quietly fishing at Lake Mead. Myers told Tippin the name of the Las Vegas hotel where her father usually stayed. Tippin's experience told him it was strange for a man to leave town so soon after his wife's murder. He asked a pal in the Las Vegas Metro Police Department to keep an eye on Dawley. Tippin's opinion of the bereaved husband was about to change. The Joan Dawley murder investigation took a strange turn when Dennis Dawley turned up in a Vegas casino at 3:30 in the morning. He was in the company of a woman. Detective Tippin received surveillance photos of the pair. After checking around, the woman was identified as Brandita Taliano. The news didn't sit well.
After I determined that he was in Las Vegas with a female, 2 days after he had buried his wife of 35 years, I became very suspicious.
Tippin looked into Taliano's background. He found that her rap sheet included convictions for prostitution and drugs. She had no fixed address. He also discovered that Taliano had been staying in the Mission Hills Motel in LA during the time of Joan Dawley's murder. The motel was just a quarter-mile down the road from where Joan's car had been recovered. This was worth a closer look.
So I went to the Mission Hills Motel, talked with the manager, and basically what happened was he gave me a list of phone calls and phone numbers going back a month.
Tippin checked the list of Taliano's outgoing calls. She had phoned Dawley's home, the golf complex where he worked, and a local bowling alley that was his favorite hangout.
Police Department, Miss Taliano?
It was time to pay a call on Taliano. He traced her to a North Hollywood motel.
Yes, ma'am. I'm Detective Tippin from the Police Department. I have a team
Detectives
of
approached
officers.
Taliano and asked to search her room. Surprisingly, she agreed without blinking an eye.
Generally speaking, I mean, if someone is that cooperative, they're not thinking that they have anything that may develop into a lead or lead you to believe that they were involved in a homicide.
The search turned up several pieces of jewelry. Most of it was junk. But one piece looked particularly valuable, and not the kind of jewelry Taliano would normally own. Taliano had an explanation ready. She told them that she was often hired to clean the Dawley's house. While she was there, she took some jewelry, but not entirely without Dennis's knowledge. They were having an affair.
She wanted us to believe that basically she was okay with being around Joan Dawley and Dennis. But Joan didn't know that the sexual activity was taking place.
Detective Tippin.
Detectives found a note stating that Dennis was nervous about Taliano keeping the jewelry. He wanted her to fence it. That suggested he was involved in its theft.
Very nice piece of jewelry here.
A few days later, Debbie Myers identified the jewelry. She recognized the piece that her mother always wore. If that were true, then Taliano couldn't have stolen it from the victim's jewelry box.
the other side.
Jones' jewelry in Taliano's possession, and a note linking Dolly to the stolen pieces. Too many coincidences were piling up too quickly.
She was a participant in the
Perhaps their secret game didn't stop at theft.
Once I identified Brandita Taliano and the things that were going on with her and Dennis Dolly, it became more and more apparent that it was a conspiracy and that these two people were involved in the case.
Investigators began to believe that Joan Dolly's murder was a crime motivated by love. Not Dennis and Brandita's love for each other, but their mutual adoration for money. If Dennis divorced his wife, he'd lose half of everything he owned. Plus, Joan had recently inherited close to $100,000. Police suspected that Dennis Dolly was a shifty and dangerous man. If he and Brandita had plotted to kill Joan because Dolly wanted all of her money, then why would he want to share it with Brandita?
I was somewhat concerned about Brandita also and her situation because I thought the possibility was there that Dennis would murder Brandita just to get her out of the way.
The evidence against the pair was only circumstantial. Investigators had no physical evidence putting them at the murder scene on the morning of April 17th. But they had enough to bring them in for questioning. At least then, authorities could keep their eyes on the pair. Based on what they had gathered so far, detectives developed a strategy. They had 48 hours to either charge them or let them go. It was a calculated risk.
Interrogation room 2.
Tippin knew he didn't have the evidence to charge them, so he was gambling that once in custody, they'd crack and turn on each other.
Mr. Donovan, will you come with me, please?
Dennis admitted to meeting Brandita Taliano on the street, and basically that's all he would admit to was, yes, he was wrong and connecting up with Brandita and having her as a girlfriend, but as far as the murder or anything else, he was not involved in anything.
I'll be right back. Sure. Okay.
Taliano told a different story.
Hi, Miss Taliano. How are you today?
A few months before Joan's murder, Taliano had been serving time in a women's prison in Los Angeles. While visiting her there, Dolly had asked her a favor. Did she know anyone he could hire for a big job? She assumed that meant murdering his wife.
Can you describe for me your relationship?
Taliano recommended a man named Gary Ware.
I'll let you know. He's pretty adamant about it.
You know, he called me hinge.
Dolly's deal with Ware must have been finalized while Taliano was in prison. She said Dolly never told her what happened. It was a hot lead, but investigators would need a lot more evidence to turn it into a murder charge that would stick. And Tippin's 48 hours were up. Authorities were forced to let Dolly and Taliano go. Ware was no choir boy. A man with a criminal record like his might be capable of committing murder for hire. His phone records showed that Dolly called him prior to Joan's death, but not afterward.
All of a sudden, I have him right in the middle of this homicide with phone calls that are being directed to him by Dennis Dolly. So I had to find out why those calls were being made and what his participation or involvement was.
How you doing?
Gary Ware. How you doing?
But a hardened criminal like Ware wouldn't just volunteer information to the police. Tippin spent a year trying to get him to talk. With his attorney present, Ware finally admitted to authorities that Dolly had contacted him with an interesting business proposition. The two agreed to meet. Dolly wanted Ware to kill his wife. He gave Ware $30,000 cash and told him he didn't care how Ware did it. but he wanted her gone. At first, Tippin couldn't understand why Ware would implicate himself in Joan Dawley's murder like this. As it turned out, he had an airtight alibi. On the morning the victim was murdered, he was in lockup at Chino State Prison. Tippin's most promising lead fizzled right before his eyes. After more than a year spent investigating Joan Dawley's murder, the case went cold. Though LAPD detectives had their suspicion, they still needed hard evidence placing Dennis Dawley and Brandita Taliano at the scene of the murder of Joan Dawley. One lead after another failed to pay off. Then, on the last day of February 1994, Detective Paul Tippin got a call that he'd been waiting 3 years for. In the time since Joan Dawley's murder, DNA analysis technology had been refined enormously. A new technique allowed even a tiny pinpoint of genetic material to be analyzed. Now, the lab could accurately test only a portion of the foreign matter found under the victim's nails without the risk of ruining the entire DNA sample. The lab's new testing technology, called PCR for polymerase chain reaction, encourages the DNA to carry out its natural function, continuous duplication. A carefully controlled environment of chemicals and heat works like a genetic copying machine. Colin Yamauchi is a criminalist with the LAPD Crime Lab DNA unit.
We can start with a small sample and put it in this instrument that can make hundreds and then thousands and then hundreds of thousands and millions of copies of that same DNA. So it was kind of an exciting time in forensic serology when PCR came online and we were able to utilize this technology.
With PCR, an immeasurable amount of DNA can be cultivated into a testable sample. The procedure was performed on a portion of material taken from beneath Joan Dawley's fingernails, then compared with DNA from her blood. It didn't match. Someone else's cells were under Joan Dawley's nails.
Now, that meant that the possibility of a suspect's DNA was there. And that was very, very important to me, because now it brought about a situation where I could maybe directly connect a suspect to the victim. And that was very, very important.
Dennis Dawley's genetic material was tested against the sample from his wife's nails. It came back negative. By this time, Brandita Taliano was in prison for an unrelated crime. A warrant was issued and a blood sample obtained. This time, Tippin got his match. Now there could be no doubt. Brandita Taliano murdered Joan Dawley. But Tippin still wasn't convinced that Taliano had acted alone. Dennis Dawley's knowledge of the stolen jewelry, his attempt to hire a hitman, and a long string of incriminating phone records before the crime implicated him in the murder.
I believe truly that they were both in it, they were both involved in it, they were both there when it happened.
The jury agreed that Dennis Dawley and Brandita Taliano had conspired and murdered Joan Dawley. Nearly 4 years after her death, her killers were sentenced to 25 years to life. Dawley and Taliano believed that murder was the easy way to wealth. Unfortunately, they weren't the only ones to feel that way. Some people make murder a part of their business plan. Livingston County, north central Missouri. Over 100 years ago, this was wild, rough country under the rule of frontier justice. Today, it has settled into the essence of rural America. Old-style towns surrounded by farmland. a place where farmers contend with the whims of the weather and the realities of economics. People here believe in an honest wage for honest work. At least most of them believe that. In October 1986, the Livingston County Sheriff's Department received a call from a nearby livestock auction company. A man named Dennis Murphy had passed a bad check for $6,000 to buy cattle. He had paid for the cattle, loaded them into a truck, and vanished. Though Murphy was a stranger, he appeared to be working with a local farmer named Ray Copeland. Ray had attended the auction, and while he hadn't bought any livestock, he provided a truck for the cattle Murphy had bought. Sheriff Gary Calvert paid Mr. Copeland a visit to find out more about Murphy.
He admitted that he knew Dennis Murphy, that Dennis had rented his pasture to keep those cows, and that he in fact had sold some cows to Dennis himself, and that Dennis had gave him a bad check also.
It might have been the end of the story, except that a month later, Calvert received another call about a drifter passing bad checks for about $6,000 worth of livestock. The drifter resold the cows, took the cash, and disappeared. Again, Ray Copeland had been at the auction, and it was his truck that carted the cattle away. But once again, Copeland said he was a victim too.
You did 5 of them already.
While that may have been true, Calvert had reasons for doubt. Ray Copeland had been arrested several times for passing bad checks of his own.
We're going to have to come up with something different.
Still, Calvert had no proof that he was behind this. Both of the cattle thieves had arrest records, consistently bouncing in and out of jail on minor charges. Calvert assumed they were bound to get arrested again. He'd catch up with them soon enough. All he had to do was wait. Two years passed without any more trouble. Then, in October 1988, Calvert learned about 3 more drifters passing bad paper for good cattle. This wasn't the kind of crime Calvert had seen a lot of. Now he'd seen 5 cases in 24 months. They had to be related. When Calvert ran a check on the 2 men who'd stolen the cows 2 years earlier, he found no record of them. They hadn't been arrested again anywhere.
Misdemeanor 1.
Calvert couldn't believe that these small-time criminals had reformed into model citizens. But he didn't know where they had gone, or if Copeland might truly be involved. Calvert had heard rumors, though. Copeland's neighbors told him that he was hiring drifters from the local mission to help him at cattle auctions because he couldn't hear well anymore. Copeland supposedly promised to pay the men $50 a day to stay on his farm and not tell anyone they were there. Even if those rumors were true, they didn't mean much. A year passed before Calvert got more information, and it wasn't what he expected. On August 20th, 1989, an anonymous caller to Nebraska's Crime Stoppers hotline tipped authorities to watch out for Ray and Fay Copeland of Mooresville, Missouri. The caller said that he had worked for the Copelands. Ray had made him buy cattle with bad checks and then threatened to kill him. He said he wasn't the first. He hinted that Ray was a murderer.
Jack McCormick?
On September 6, 1989, just 2 weeks after the phone tip, the anonymous caller surfaced. Jack McCormick was picked up outside Salem, Oregon, for sleeping by the side of a highway. When the police computer revealed an outstanding warrant for bad checks in Missouri, he was extradited. When he got there, he admitted making the anonymous call.
Jack, you have a slight problem with
McCormick said that Copeland met him in a homeless shelter and hired him to work on his farm. After he moved into Copeland's house, Copeland opened a bank account for him so he could buy cattle. It seemed like a square deal. But McCormick grew suspicious when he found a closet full of men's clothes that belonged to other men from the shelter. Some had their names written inside, a common practice among drifters. During the 15 days he lived at the farm, McCormick said he made several cattle purchases for Ray and Fay Copeland. Fay kept the books. But soon McCormick overdrew the bank account, and the Sullivan County Sheriff issued a warrant for his arrest. Right after that, on August 10, 1989, McCormick claimed that Copeland tried to kill him with a .22 rifle. Then, for some reason, Copeland changed his mind. McCormick fled the county. It sounded like a wild story, but the sheriff couldn't dismiss it out of hand. Then came the wildest accusation of all. McCormick said he found a human skull and leg bone on Copeland's farm.
When he suggested that what might be happening here is that Mr. Copeland may be killing people, we thought we better look into it.
Based on what McCormick told authorities, and coupled with the fact that 2 of the cattle thieves were seen with Ray Copeland, the sheriff had enough to arrest Ray and his wife Fay for charges relating to check fraud. A search warrant was issued to determine if they were up to something far worse. A drifter named Jack McCormick accused Ray and Fay Copeland of murder. He said the evidence was buried on their farm. On October 9, 1989, the couple was taken into custody.
Step out here now. Step up. Right over the wall. No. Sir, you're under arrest for the devil. Sit up. Back here.
With the Copelands behind bars at the Livingston County Jail, the officers searched the farmhouse. They found items that seemed to substantiate Jack McCormick's account.
Why don't you go ahead and bag this rifle up?
First was the closet of men's clothes.
We have the victim's clothing up here.
Fay had been cutting them up to make a quilt. Some of the clothes had the names of the missing men in them, just as McCormick had described. The officers also found a list of men's names hidden in a camera case. It included the men who had passed bad checks. The ones who vanished had X's beside them.
Let's go ahead and keep track of that.
If McCormick was telling the truth and Copeland was a killer, Sheriff Calvert would have to find the bodies. But after a week of searching, the officers found no trace of the missing men. While the Copeland farm was being searched, TV stations began reporting on the case. Rancher Keith Albright saw the story and called the sheriff to report what he knew.
Yeah, this is Mr. Albright out here on Alaskan Road.
Albright had rented a farm just 6 miles from Copeland's. Ray had done some odd jobs for him. Albright told police that he had found some bones out in a field. At the time, he thought they were animal bones. Now, he wasn't so sure. Having found no bodies on Copeland's farm, police believed that Albright might be onto something. If Copeland were guilty, he wouldn't be careless enough to bury all his victims on his own land. They spread out to search Albright's farm. In the barn, they noticed that some areas of the dirt floor had been disturbed. They began to dig. By the end of the day, officers uncovered 3 bodies from shallow graves on Albright's property. Calls kept pouring into the sheriff's department, and they tracked down every promising lead.
When people found out that we were suspicious of what he may have been doing, they became suspicious about everything that they had seen him doing. So we went on a lot of wild goose chases.
All right, looks like we have something down here. Don't quite know what it is.
When the bodies started turning up,
let's see what we
Copeland,
got here.
perhaps trying to minimize his involvement, began telling wild stories. He said he overheard some strangers talking about dumping a body down a neighbor's well. Sure enough, investigators found the body of one of the missing drifters. But the lie backfired. The discovery implicated Copeland even further.
All right, lay it down here. We got.
The search on that farm intensified, and a fifth victim was excavated from beneath 2,000 bales of hay. Using dental records, the 5 men were positively identified a few weeks later. Among them was Dennis Murphy, pulled from his watery grave. It was a good start, but investigators needed forensic evidence to tie Copeland more directly to the murdered men. Calvert gathered the .22 rifle found in Copeland's house and a pile of .22 slugs recovered from the bodies and delivered them to the Missouri State Highway Patrol. The rifle was test-fired in their crime lab. It would leave its unique set of markings on the slugs as they hurled down the barrel. A comparison microscope was used to compare the markings. On one side, the test-fired slug. On the other, a slug pulled from one of the 5 murder victims. The marks on the slugs lined up exactly. To firearms and ballistics expert Todd Garrison, that meant only one thing.
After comparison and examinations, we could conclusively say this particular bullet had been fired from this particular Marlin firearm obtained from the Copeland farm.
Bullets from the same rifle killed each of the 5 victims. But investigators still needed to know if Faye Copeland had any role in this. The note found in the Copeland's house told volumes. Ray, who was illiterate, couldn't have written the names on the list. To see if she was the author, Calvert turned the list over to Missouri State Highway Patrol's handwriting section. Though a person's handwriting varies, certain features remain consistent. Handwriting expert Don Locke compared the note against a known sample of Faye's handwriting. He noted several distinctive characteristics. For example, the letter B always appeared in uppercase, even in the middle of a word. Locke concluded that this and other details were common to the note and to examples of Faye's handwriting. But what about the X's? It was possible that Faye had simply written the list of names, and Ray had placed the X's by them as he killed the men. That would be harder to judge.
Could one simply look at the X's and positively identify those X's to someone? No. But they were there, and as I said, they were consistent with the writing that was positively identified.
Locke even compared the ink used to write the names against the ink used to write the X's. His conclusion? The same ink had been used for both. Faye Copeland wrote the names and marked the X's as her husband killed the men one by one. Locke and Garrison provided the forensic evidence to charge the Copelands with 5 counts of first-degree murder. On November 12, 1990, Faye was sentenced to death. Ray followed her on May 22, 1991. For 2 years, Faye and Ray Copeland were the only couple on death row sentenced for the same crime. Ray Copeland cheated the executioner when he died in October 1993 at the Potosi Correctional Center. In 1999, his wife of over 50 years had her sentence reduced to life. Though neither of the Copelands ever confessed, investigators pieced together this scenario. Ray somehow came up with the idea of hiring drifters to write the checks for him.
Get that gate, make sure that gate is locked. Yeah, the gate, got the gate. Come on.
After the men outlived their usefulness, or when the warrants for passing bad checks piled up,
There you go.
Copeland murdered them. And Fay kept the books. How much is a human life worth? Police estimated that the Copelands made $30,000 from their scheme. $6,000 a victim. They thought no one would notice a few missing drifters. They were wrong. It's often said that two heads are better than one. When committing murder, having a partner gives police twice as much evidence to gather and twice as much chance to catch the killers. Investigators grapple with the case of a sexual sadist who's leaving behind painfully few clues. Even his victim is anonymous. When a woman steps out of her house and vanishes, detectives find evidence that she's never coming back. With no body, no witnesses, and scant clues, the truth about her fate hangs by a hair. A hideous crime comes to light in a remote river, but all evidence has been washed clean. Investigators have no hope of solving it unless the murderer strikes again. Greed, rage, and revenge provide most killers motivation, but some hunt just for sport. To catch these murderers, investigators must follow a trail of scattered clues. Beneath the gaze of California's Sierra Nevada mountains lies the resort community of Lake Tahoe. Clean air and majestic forests instill a sense of harmony. But for one lost traveler, this was the cruelest place on earth. On September 17, 1987, investigators from the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department were called to an isolated spot off the side of an abandoned service road. The young woman had been gagged with a scrap of pantyhose. Investigators found what they believed to be the murder weapon, a strangulation device made from a tree branch and a shred of the victim's clothing that appeared cut with scissors. Unlike a rope or bare hands, a garrote is primarily used for torture. The killer went to a good deal of trouble to find a place to stage his lengthy assault. Sergeant Jim Watson was surprised to find a body in such a remote spot.
And at that point, it was just a big question mark in my mind. How did she get here? Where did she come from? A lot of unanswered questions at that point, but it was where we started.
What they did know was that the killer must have picked this location ahead of time. The remote service road was hard to find, not a place one simply stumbled upon. And it wasn't chosen merely as a place to dump a body. The path was too steep for carrying the victim. The absence of injury to the soles of her feet told detectives that her shoes weren't removed until she was walked down here. Working outward in a spiral pattern, they scoured the ground for additional clues.
We began a sweep of the entire area from here up to the highway, which is about a third of a mile. That sweep revealed pieces of clothing that were scattered on various bushes and trees from here up to the main highway.
Technicians collected what they believed to be the remains of the victim's outfit: a dress, a pair of underwear, a single shoe, and pantyhose remnants. Not knowing what might be of use later, they also collected a pack of cigarettes and a butane lighter. Some white cord found nearby suggested that the killer restrained his victim before he killed her. Detectives had no clue to the victim's identity, nor any solid leads on her killer. They hoped the medical examiner would give them something they could use. The post-mortem examination placed her between the ages of 16 and 21. She had a large contusion on her head, but that wasn't the fatal injury. The ligature around her neck had ended her life. Based on the amount of decay, the medical examiner estimated that she had died 2 to 4 weeks earlier. No tissue was found under her fingernails. No foreign fluids were found on her body. Technicians used sticky tape to pick up trace fibers from textiles. They processed every square inch of the victim's clothing and cataloged each shred in the hopes that one day they'd find a source of comparison. But without a suspect, this trace evidence was useless. And until they could identify the victim, the murder investigation was at a standstill. A sadistic predator was free to roam and to kill again. Detectives scoured hundreds of missing persons records, but to no avail. The papers published an artist's rendering of the dead woman. Tips poured in from families and friends searching for missing teenage girls. One by one, each was eliminated. There was nothing to do but wait. As months passed, the missing person search gradually spread up the coast. It wasn't until 4 months later, in January 1988, that police got a call from a Seattle woman who recognized the girl. Dental records finally gave the victim a name. 17-year-old Darcy Frackenpole was a runaway from Seattle who tried to build a life in Sacramento. She ended up working as a prostitute. Friends last saw her on August 24th, 3 weeks before her body was found. For a predator looking to kill, prostitutes make easy targets. Night after night, they let strangers drive them into the darkness. Sometimes they don't come back. Investigators looked for similar attacks on prostitutes in the Sacramento area. One caught their attention. 3 days before Darcy's body was found, another prostitute had a brutal run-in with a customer. While leaning over to lock the door, the man grabbed her wrists and attempted to handcuff her. But before he managed to subdue her, a police officer cruising in the neighborhood noticed the struggling couple and interceded. After the prostitute escaped from the car, the perpetrator tried to bolt, but he was caught.
window. Out the window. Open the door. Slowly. Keep your hands in the air, face the building, walk backward.
One good look at a bag found on his back seat told police that the prostitute had gotten away just in time. It contained a pair of scissors, handcuffs, and a garrote assembled from 2 wooden dowels and a length of white cord. It seemed to be some sort of crime kit. Police arrested the suspect, 48-year-old Roger Kibbe. A furniture maker by trade, Kibbe had a burglary record that spanned 2 decades. Illiterate but intelligent, acquaintances described him as a quiet man who liked to take long drives at night. He was given an 8-month sentence for assaulting the prostitute. While he was in prison, Darcy Frackenpole had been identified in Lake Tahoe, over 80 miles away, and the hunt was on for her killer. Kibbe's attack on the prostitute in Sacramento and his crime kit gave investigators the haunting suspicion that this wasn't his first strike. They didn't know how many women had made the mistake of climbing into Kibbe's passenger seat. They wondered if Frackenpole was one of them. A garrote is an unusual and memorable weapon. Though the one found in Kibbe's crime kit didn't resemble the makeshift device used to kill Frackenpole, the white cord used in its construction resembled the rope found at her murder scene. And like his assault victim in Sacramento, Frackenpole was a prostitute. Investigators questioned him, hoping that he would incriminate himself in the Frackenpole murder. He denied any involvement. Detectives' suspicions were purely circumstantial. The only thing they had to go on was the nylon cord. It deserved a closer look. Under the magnification of a stereo microscope, technicians compared the cord samples from both Frackenpole's murder scene and Kibbe's car. Both strands contained the same number of fibers, made up of the same weave and pattern. Investigators discovered that this wasn't just household rope. It was parachute cord. They learned that Kibbe worked at a storage facility and rented a unit there. They obtained a warrant to search it.
Oh yeah, right there. It's a skydiving certificate for Roger.
They learned that he enjoyed skydiving, and when they removed a photograph from the wall, they made an unexpected discovery. The picture was hanging from a length of parachute cord, exactly like that found at both crime scenes. But it was hardly a smoking gun. Investigators found nothing to definitively link Kibbe to the death of Darcy Frackenpole. This relatively common rope would not support the weight of a murder investigation. Unless they found more evidence, Kibbe would be out of prison in just a few months, and then would probably disappear. But tiny fibers might prove stronger than sturdy cord. Now that investigators had a suspect, they could compare the trace evidence originally collected from Frackenpole's clothing to fibers collected from Kibbe.
There are many serial type crimes that we don't have blood analysis or DNA analysis, and if there's not bullets or blood or semen, we have no other option other than to look at the particulate or the trace evidence.
At the California Department of Justice Crime Lab, criminalist Faye Springer scrutinized the numerous fiber lifts taken from Darcy Frackenpole's clothing. Hours can be spent analyzing 1 square inch. After 3 weeks poring over the evidence, Springer found 2 fibers that stood out because of their larger size. The distinct shape and color of the fiber's cross-section told her that they were fibers from a blue nylon carpet. Here's where her 30 years' experience paid off. She asked investigators to find out what kind of car Kibbe had been driving at the time of the assault. A search warrant was executed, and the suspect's car was taken in for inspection. Springer was on target. The floor mats were blue. What's more, one had a red stain on it. A sample was collected and sent for testing. The results were disappointing. It turned out to be paint. But the blue fibers from Kibbe's car still had forensic value. A sample was compared with the fibers found on the victim's clothing. Not only were the shape and composition of the strands the same, a spectral dye analysis confirmed that they were exactly the same color. Was this proof that Darcy Frackenpole was in Kibbe's vehicle? Not quite. The same blue carpeting could be found in tens of thousands of vehicles. If investigators were going to catch Kibbe, they'd need something more conclusive. But one strange similarity couldn't be accounted for. Both the fibers from the car and the ones from the victim's clothing were peppered with tiny football-shaped specks. Samples of both were sent to a lab in Chicago that specializes in identifying microscopic contaminants. Until the results came back, investigators had no other evidence beside the parachute cord. As they began their careful scrutiny for something they might have overlooked, they realized that Kibbe might have left behind just enough rope to hang himself. In California, criminalist Faye Springer was trying to use 3 lengths of rope to lasso a killer. She examined the ropes under higher and higher magnification until she noticed something strange. The rope found at the Darcy Frackenpole murder scene had tiny red paint flecks in it. So did the cord from the garrote found in Roger Kibbe's car. So did the sample from his storage unit. Spectral analysis showed that the paint on the 3 cords had the same chemical composition, including some microscopic black specks that must have gotten trapped beneath the drying paint. It was a powerful connection.
So it looked like not only did we have the same kind of cordage, but we had cordage that lived or existed in the same environment, was exposed to the same kind of contaminants.
For all intents and purposes, it was the same rope. But investigators needed more to tie up their case. That's when the call came from the testing lab in Chicago. They had finished analyzing the carpet fibers. The unidentified football shapes found on the carpet fibers were fungal spores, single-celled organisms that could have come from dirt or mold. But there was something else. The lab's powerful microscopes had identified a red spot on the carpet fiber found on the victim's clothes. It was paint. It had the same properties as the paint on the floor mat of Kibbe's car. The carpet fibers weren't just similar, they were identical. Both contained the same football-shaped fungal spores and the same paint stains. The victim and suspect had now been irrefutably linked.
What about the other one there?
Roger Kibbe was arrested on April 25, 1988, for the murder of Darcy Frackenpole. By trial time, police had pieced together the details of the victim's last night. She had been working the streets when she accepted an invitation that would turn out to be a date with death. Investigators suspect that after restraining her with the parachute cord, Kibbe brought her to a place he'd selected in advance. After cutting up her clothing and torturing her for several hours, he killed her, then scattered her clothes. Roger Kibbe was found guilty of murder in the first degree and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. No one knows how many other victims met a fate similar to Darcy Frackenpole's. At least 3 other murders matching Roger Kibbe's MO are thought to be his work. Had it not been for a powerful microscope and some shrewd detective work, the number might still be rising. Roger Kibbe had covered his tracks by heading out in search of strangers. But not all predators hunt far from home. On a brisk October morning in 1992, neighbors saw Laura Hoteling leave the Bethesda, Maryland home that she shared with her mother. The 24-year-old Harvard graduate moved back after college and had no trouble finding a job at a consulting firm. But on this day, she never made it to work. A close friend and colleague went to check on her. Though the back door was open, she found the house empty.
Anyone home? Laura? Laura? Someone didn't come to work today.
There was no sign of Laura, nor any hint about where she'd gone.
Laura, I know you're here.
She contacted Laura's family, concerned that there was some sort of emergency. They were as puzzled as her friend. Laura's mother cut her business trip short. Neither she nor her son had any idea where Laura could be. She was not the type to run off without leaving word. Serious about her career, Laura was known for her diligence and punctuality. No burdensome secret seemed to be weighing on her mind. She didn't hint about leaving town. Her family filed a missing persons report with the Montgomery County Police. At this point, all Detective Ed Tarney could do was a routine check.
We checked with the friends. They had not heard from her. She did not leave a note. It was just very suspicious. We also, through the course of the investigation, we checked all her credit cards, bank accounts. There had been no activity.
But as missing persons cases go, this was in its infancy. It had only been a few days since Laura Hoteling was last seen. Though there had been no sign of her, there hadn't been any indication of foul play either.
Hey, how's it going, pal? Good.
Police
good.
interviewed the Hoteling's friends, their neighbors, their gardener.
Hi, nice to meet you. I wonder if you'd,
No one could offer any information regarding the woman's disappearance.
you seen her lately? No.
After seeing her leave for work the previous morning, there'd been no sign of Laura, nor any indication of trouble at her house. But then, as they searched the woods around the house, investigators found something that told them this was more than a missing persons case. The pillowcase and pillow inside it were stained with what appeared to be blood.
When we took the bloody pillowcase back to the house, it matched up with the other pillowcases that were there. And at that time, we knew we had something very, very serious.
To find out more about the stains, investigators turned to forensic scientist Susan Ballou at the Montgomery County Crime Lab.
I take the pillowcase off the pillow.
Okay.
Ballou first tested the stains to confirm that they were made by human blood.
We wanted to see if we could pick up a type consistent with Laura. We knew from her donations to the Red Cross facility that she was a type A blood.
The blood stain from the pillow was shown to be of the same type. From its bright red color, Ballou knew that she was looking at stains less than a week old. Though her findings could only prove that someone with type A blood had bled on Laura Hoteling's bedroom pillow, it was enough to turn the missing persons case into a potential homicide. Investigators needed to find out what had happened in Laura's room. Beneath the bedspread, they found something strange. There was a flat sheet on the bed, but the fitted sheet was gone. And on the mattress underneath were some faint stains that looked like more blood. Investigators saturated the mattress with a chemical called luminol. When it combines with blood proteins, even those invisible to the naked eye, it glows. Viewed in the dark, Laura's mattress radiated a pattern of blood spots and streaks that spelled murder.
There was a large quantity of blood that showed up on that bed. That's when we knew she had probably been murdered there in her bedroom.
The lack of spatter on the surrounding walls or furniture told detectives that the killer had used the pillow to staunch the blood flow. The absence of a blood trail leading from the bedroom suggested that the killer had either cleaned his tracks or wrapped the body before removing it from the house. Investigators collected fibers and samples of Laura's hair in case they ever had the need to make a comparison. Meantime, technicians searched the pillowcase for any link to the suspect. A crucial detail surfaced. Based on the repeated pattern of triangular smears, they surmised that the killer had stabbed the victim with a narrow, pointed weapon, which was then wiped on the fabric. Hidden in the corner of the pillowcase, Ballou uncovered a more significant discovery.
And when I looked at these areas closely, I could see partial impressions of prints on them, which turned out to be what's called a patent print, a print that is made in blood. However, there was not sufficient ridge detail to get enough information from it.
In its current state, the print was too vague to be used for identification. But criminalists like Ballou have ways of turning faint prints into glaring evidence. She applied a protein-sensitive dye to enhance the pattern.
See what we can do with it.
Now that they had a viable print, all they needed was a suspect.
Hold this here so I can rinse some more off.
Mrs. Hoteling couldn't think of anyone who would want to harm her daughter. She did recall, though, that their gardener, Haddon Clark, had been fascinated by Laura since his first day on the job. She also told police that she'd discovered her spare key was missing. Clark had worked for the family for several months. During the day, he was allowed in to use their bathroom or help himself to some coffee. Overnight, he lived out of a truck that he kept in a nearby church parking lot.
How long have you been working for the hotel?
Though Clark denied any knowledge of an attack on Laura Hoteling, his agitated behavior cast him in doubt. It wasn't Clark's first brush with the law. He had once been arrested on a burglary charge. When Clark's prints were compared against the patent print from the pillowcase, they matched. The suspicious gardener had left his print in wet blood on the victim's bedroom pillow. And the only way he could have done that, police contended, was if he had killed her. Though they still had no body, police arrested Clark on November 6, 1992. Inside his truck, along with his gardening tools, they found a hardware store receipt for carpenter's twine, duct tape, and plastic sheeting. Ordinarily harmless materials that homicide investigators see more than their share of. Detectives believed that Clark was the killer. Proving it would be another matter. Despite the circumstantial evidence heaped against him, all police had was a bloody fingerprint. Clark's lawyers were already formulating their rebuttal. The homeless man regularly scavenged through trash in the woods. He could have easily left an innocent fingerprint on the pillowcase. It was up to the prosecution to prove otherwise.
So at that point, we realized the fingerprint was not going to be the crux of this particular case, and we had to go further.
Despite his dubious profile, detectives didn't have a single shred of physical evidence to tie Clark to the murder. And without a body, the case would be nearly impossible to prove. Investigators searched Clark's squalid campsite for a weapon, or even a body, but no weapons were found, and the only bodies were the game he trapped for food. Detectives began to scour the place for tinier clues to prove Laura had been there, but realized that finding anything of value in this hovel would be impossible. The trial date was just weeks away. If the prosecution failed to convince a jury of Clark's guilt, they wouldn't be able to try him again, even if the body turned up later. And without any convincing evidence, it seemed their case against the gardener would wither on the vine. The trial date was drawing near, and Maryland investigators needed to find some physical link between Haddon Clark and the victim, Laura Hoteling. Because the victim's body hadn't been found, the case would have to hinge on other evidence. Investigators were at a loss to determine what that evidence might be. While they searched the suspect's belongings, forensic technician Susan Ballou continued processing the evidence from the crime scene. In preparation for any possible hair comparison, Ballou inspected more than 90 hairs taken from the victim's hairbrush and made a shocking discovery.
When I started to do that, I noticed that one of the fibers I put under the microscope was a wig fiber. And it just jumps out at you. It is so different from an actual hair, and it caught me off guard. May I speak to Ed Tarney, please?
Ballou learned that none of the victim's family or friends owned or wore wigs. From receipts found in Clark's truck, investigators learned of a storage facility that he rented in Rhode Island. Investigators realized that his penchant for dressing up might be the one thing that could finally expose him. If technicians could prove that the single wig fiber found in the victim's brush had come from one of the suspect's wigs, they would be able to show that he had been at the scene of the crime, disguised. Ballou pulled sample hair fibers from each of the 24 wigs and compared them to the single wig fiber found in the victim's hairbrush.
After looking at under the microscope at all the different fibers from these wigs, I found one wig that the fiber from that wig had the same color composition, the same diameter. It also had the same internal characteristics as that one wig fiber that I recovered from that hairbrush.
Now that Ballou had narrowed her search to one wig, she sent it with the original strand to a crime lab that specializes in hair testing. The last and most definitive test would compare the dyes in both samples. Though indistinguishable to the human eye, each wig manufactured in the U.S. has a unique fingerprint. Each of the approximately 7,000 commercial dyes is trademarked by the company that formulated it. The lab studied the samples under a microscope sensitive to ultraviolet rays. They called Ballou with their findings.
They were able to determine that that dye content in the wig, as well as that question fiber recovered from the brush, were in fact one and the same.
Clark's defense attorneys couldn't get around this single strand of hair. Realizing he couldn't skirt the evidence, Clark confessed. He plea bargained to murder in the second degree. In exchange for the reduced charge, he agreed to reveal Laura Hoteling's grave, located near his campsite. Clark admitted to having stabbed the victim with a pair of scissors. The autopsy concluded she was also suffocated. Ultimately, investigators pieced together her final hour. Driven by sick obsession, Clark learned that his victim would be alone while her mother was out of town. Using the spare key, he entered the house, smothered Hoteling with a pillow, then stabbed her in the neck. Clark must have rolled the body in the missing bedsheet, then wrapped it with the plastic and tape he'd purchased from the hardware store. He loaded the body in the truck and drove to a clearing near his campsite, where a shallow grave awaited. The following morning, Clark returned to the scene of the crime to clean up and cover his tracks. He figured that by posing as Laura Hoteling, he'd throw any nosy neighbors off his track. His last look in the mirror would prove his undoing. Without the ironclad forensic case against him, Clark probably would have never confessed. His victim's body might still be lying in a lonely grave, and Haddon Clark might have extended his killing streak. Thankfully, the devious killer couldn't escape the evidence. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison.
Please hurry, he's trying to kill me.
There's no telling where a trail of evidence might lead. Sometimes investigators stumble onto more than they bargained for. At 4:30 a.m. on January 21st, 1995, the Marion County, Oregon police received a phone call from a prostitute named Lisa Louise Benson, who claimed to have been attacked. Benson was brought to the hospital for treatment. Lieutenant Bob Stye questioned her about the terrifying ordeal.
She had ligature marks across her neck and also had an abrasion and the signs of bruising on the back of her neck, and had abrasions on her hands and up on her knees.
Her injuries were photographed as evidence. Earlier that morning, she told investigators a customer had tried to kill her. She'd never seen the man before, but he didn't appear threatening. She climbed into his truck. He brought Benson to a retail carpet outlet. After roughing her up in an office, he forced her into the warehouse. He tied her to a forklift and told her she was going to die.
And then hoisted her, literally hoisted the lift up to where she was dangling with her feet about 6 or 8 inches off the ground.
She hung there for almost a minute. Then the rope broke and she fought her way free. The plastic wrap that bound her wrists was taken into evidence. Police learned from the carpet store manager that one employee, Larry Reed, fit the suspect's description. When Reed showed up to work the next day, police were there to meet him. He admitted that he'd picked up a hooker the night before, but when questioned about it, he became evasive and uncooperative. He refused to give any more information without an attorney present. Police heard all they needed. They arrested Reed for the attempted murder of Lisa Benson. A look into his background revealed a disturbing history of assaults on little girls and elderly women. He had been institutionalized more than once, but nothing, it seemed, could tame his instinct to prey on vulnerable females. Reed fit the profile of a sadistic sexual predator, but so far the case against him was based only on the word of a prostitute. To make the conviction stick, detectives needed physical evidence proving that he caused her injuries. They obtained a warrant to search the office where Benson claimed to have been attacked. They found blood spatter throughout the office. The pattern of droplets revealed repeated blows to the body, probably with a blunt instrument. The underside of the carpet disclosed 2 large bloodstains, although the top of the carpet had been cleaned. Criminalists are often called on to build a case from a single drop of blood. In this case, however, they had copious amounts. They found more on the dashboard, glove compartment, and steering column of Reed's car. The evidence was sent to the lab. The results were anything but routine. Tests confirmed that all the samples were blood, but not a drop of it came from Lisa Benson. Investigators in Oregon faced an unnerving predicament. Their routine investigation into Lisa Benson's assault had exposed a much greater crime. Not only was Benson's blood a mismatch, the spatter and saturated carpet didn't correspond to her injuries. Forensics determined that the amount of bloodshed indicated that someone had been brutally murdered in the manager's office. Now they had a homicide investigation with no clues about the victim. They didn't even know when he or she was killed. They did, however, have a suspect, Larry Reed. His manager at the carpet warehouse told investigators that almost 2 months earlier, Reed had said he needed his carpet cleaned. Reed explained the situation to his boss.
Mr. Reed had reported that a customer had come into the business during the evening hours of December 7th, and that this person had complained about being sick and had gone into this office and had thrown up, and in throwing up he had also thrown up some blood.
The story was unlikely, but at least it gave investigators a time frame for the murder. A little research brought to light an unsolved murder in the next county. In December 1994, fishermen noticed something peculiar floating in the Santiam River. Closer inspection revealed it was a body. They marked the location and contacted the sheriff's office. Investigators retrieved the nude body of a woman from the muddy water. Though the water had distorted her features beyond recognition, the numerous wounds to her head were plain to see. Someone had murdered this woman and dumped her body into the river. These murky depths, the killer hoped, would conspire to keep his secrets hidden forever. The medical examiner determined that the victim was around 40 years old. The degree of tissue decay and the amount of mud and algae coating the body told him that she'd been in the water for several weeks. 7 penetrating wounds had fractured her skull, inflicting fatal damage. From the size and magnitude of the wounds, the pathologist believed the murder weapon to be a tool with a hammerhead on one side and a cutting blade on the other. Identifying the victim would be a challenge. Because she had no fillings, there would be no dental records for comparison. And because of her time in the water, technicians were unable to render fingerprints by the standard inking method. But they had other ways. The hands were amputated according to standard scientific practice and sent to the police lab. There, highly detailed photographs of the fingertips were taken. These photographs were compared to a police database of fingerprints from women matching the victim's description. They came up with a match. The fingerprints belonged to Marjorie Lynn Sessions, a 38-year-old prostitute.
Detectives from the Lynn County Sheriff's Office, which is south of us, advised that they were working a homicide case involving a woman named Margie Sessions. The detectives from Lynn County advised that Margie's lifestyle was one of being involved with the methamphetamine use and prostitution.
December 7th, the same day that Reed reported the bloody carpet stain, was the day Marjorie Sessions had last been seen alive. Since both women were prostitutes, it appeared that his attack on Lisa Benson was part of his chilling pattern.
And so it was those two significant facts that led detectives to kind of put the two cases together.
Only a DNA test could definitively link Reed to the murder of Marjorie Sessions. If the victim's DNA matched DNA taken from the blood found at the carpet warehouse, investigators would have their man. It wasn't so easy. The victim had been in the river so long that the water degraded the DNA in her blood. But there was one last chance. In March 1995, 3 months after her death, the victim's body was exhumed. Technicians extracted dental pulp and bone marrow. From these samples, they generated a DNA barcode. In order to confirm that the DNA had not been degraded, technicians compared it against tissue samples from the victim's parents. The genetic pattern was intact. When tested against the blood samples from the suspect's office, it matched the DNA pattern for every stain collected. The blood work proved that Marjorie Sessions had been wounded in Larry Reed's office and that the suspect had transferred some of the blood to the interior of his vehicle. But it couldn't prove for a fact that Larry Reed had killed her. The only way to do that would be to establish a relationship between the suspect and the dumping of the body. Before they could solve this case, investigators had one more river to cross. In order to prove that Larry Reed had murdered Marjorie Sessions, detectives needed to show that the suspect was responsible for disposing of her body in the river. Scouring police records for similar attacks in the area, they made a crucial discovery. Back on December 7th, the day after Sessions was last seen alive, an illegal dumping report was filed in neighboring Polk County. Residents had reported a man fitting Reed's description getting out of a pickup truck to dump trash along a roadside.
Make sure we get that tag.
The bag, which bore traces of blood, contained blood-stained paper towels. Mixed among them was a single sheet of plastic shrink wrap. Nearby, investigators found a carpet remnant, also spotted with blood. They had no way to trace whose blood it was or who had dumped the trash there until now. Samples had been saved and were brought to the forensics lab. Each item was carefully studied. The single piece of plastic wrap was compared with the wrap collected from the Benson case. Criminalist Brad Putnam performed the analysis.
The first thing we did was look at the class characteristics, the physical characteristics of the plastic. Is it clear? Is it colored? Is it opaque? Can you see through it? We took measurements of the thickness, of the width.
Experts couldn't prove that the plastic wrap found at the dump site came from the same roll as the plastic used to gag Lisa Benson. But they were able to prove that it was identical to the wrap found at the factory where Reed worked. It was of the exact same shape, width, and coloring.
Now that was real significant for us because we knew Mr. Reed worked as a carpet salesman. We also knew that at the carpet store, he had used plastic shrink wrap on Miss Benson to put around her mouth and around her throat. And we had the same type of plastic wrap found at the illegal dump site.
The blood found on the carpet and paper towels sealed Reed's fate. It matched the blood found in his office. It had come from Marjorie Sessions. Based solely on forensic evidence, detectives had pieced together the details of her murder, from initial contact to the time her body entered the water.
Forensics supported witness statements from the unlawful dumping. It helped solidify some of the theories that may have been going on and really tied kind of a multi-jurisdictional nightmare into a nice, tidy package for the prosecution.
There you go. My name's Larry. Marjorie.
Janice.
Police believe that on the night of December 7th, Reed picked up Sessions at a bar.
I'll catch you later. Okay. See you later.
As he had done with Benson, he brought her back to his manager's office, where things turned violent. Repeated blows to her head ended her life. Reed then dumped the body in the Santiam River. Even if she were eventually found, he thought, there would be no way to tie her to him. But Reed underestimated the power of forensics to draw a link with Marjorie Sessions. to coax DNA from the grave and to turn flimsy bits of trash into an incontrovertible murder charge.
Confronted with that much physical evidence, it's pretty hard to deny involvement.
Reed was sentenced to 40 years for the murder of Marjorie Sessions and the attack on Lisa Benson. Thanks to the forensics analysis, a case that seemed destined to go unsolved was proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. And a predator who may have gone on hunting for years was stopped in his tracks. Honing their skills with each attack, sadistic killers are some of the most difficult criminals to catch. Today, science is giving law enforcement the edge. With the use of advanced forensic techniques, investigators can build a solid case from the scattered clues they leave in their wake.